Good morning and welcome to our December Dementia Dialogue entitled Driving with Dementia. Those of you who are joining us for our live call, you may be a little bit surprised by that topic. We had originally listed it as a year in review. And as we sat together and discussed what had transpired over the past year, we kept reflecting on how driving was a theme that kept coming forward for us. Through a couple conferences that we put on, through work with our social workers. This is a conversation that just continued to come forward with our caregivers, and so we decided for the last minute switch to have a little bit of time discussing the important topic of driving. And all of you caregivers who are joining us, I know you will understand the adaptability that it's required as a caregiver, and so will join us and enjoy this time together this morning. My name is Heather Mulder, and I am the Outreach Senior Manager here at Banner Alzheimer's Institute, and I'll also be your moderator. Now, in 2018, our Dementia Dialogue series, we have been in a pursuit of answers where we have been examining one question that has been pertinent for caregivers each month. And for this month, we're actually going to tackle the topic, when is it time to take the keys? I know this is a big struggle for caregivers. Driving is independence and it's freedom, and it's been something that we've been doing for the majority of our lives. And so this is often a very difficult conversation to have, and caregivers are remiss in knowing how to tackle this topic. I want to introduce our expert today, Lori Nissen. Lori Nissen is a licensed clinical social worker who has spent more than 20 years specializing in leadership and clinical positions, supporting the needs of patients and families coping with emotional, movement, memory, and behavioral problems. She is a distinguished speaker who provides training and education to professionals, patients, and caregivers on topics relating to memory changes, movement disorders, and behavioral health concerns. Nissen actively serves on the Desert Southwest chapter of the Arizona Alzheimer's Association Leadership Council, the Governor's Office on Aging, Arizona Alzheimer's Task Force, and the Arizona Dementia Caregiver Alliance. She was awarded a Practice Change Leader in Aging and Health Fellowship in 2018, and also serves as the Director of Family and Community Services here at Banner Alzheimer's Institute and Banner Sun Health Research Institute. Thanks for joining us, Lori.
Thanks for having me, Heather.
I think we'll go ahead and just dive right in and kind of start at the beginning. The first question that comes to mind is, why does driving become dangerous for someone with dementia?
Well, I'm glad you started your introduction talking a little bit about the sensitivity around driving, because as you mentioned, driving is really a symbol of independence. It's a rite of passage for many of us, and it's really a tough issue and a tough thing to tackle. However, that being said, dementia can really present lots of problems and interfere with someone's ability to drive safely. So a diagnosis of dementia is not a reason in itself to give up driving. In fact, statistically, 1 in 3 people with dementia still drive. But driving, we all kind of get in our mode of being an autopilot, but if you really kind of think about driving, it really requires a lot of good judgment, split-second thoughts, as well as the ability to have really good acute senses, visual, auditory, and also manual skills. So really, when we think about driving safely, having good attention and concentration is paramount. To be able to focus if someone jumps in your lane unexpectedly, visual spatial skills, which we know are affected in dementia, as well as the attention and concentration, is really important to make sure that you're going the right speed and distance, you're the right position in the road. Those problem-solving skills, like responding to incidents, diversions, or even obstacles in the road, is really an important skill to have. Good judgment and decision-making, which is often impaired in dementia, being able to interpret weather conditions or what other drivers are doing. And then your reaction time, which can be really significantly impaired in dementia. The ability to act very quickly is important. And then I think we all know from driving in traffic or in difficult conditions, just having patience and being able to stay calm in those situations is very important. And all of these are features that can be impaired in somebody who has dementia.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that comes to mind for me, I work with crisis intervention officers quite a bit, and the conversation always comes forward about the silver alerts that we see here in Arizona over the roadways. And in conversation with them, they said actually nearly 90 to 95% of the silver alerts are for someone with dementia. So even navigation, becoming disoriented in your environment as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tough balance because, you talk with families. I'm a social worker by trade, and you talk with families and they say, well, my person with dementia hasn't gotten lost yet.
Yes.
But it's just that one last trip to the Safeway they've been going to since they retired for 20 years, and then they end up not in Phoenix but in Yuma. That really makes things dangerous for the person with dementia and for other drivers, and also for the well-being of the family that surrounds them.
And so I think you bring up a good point too, because I hear that quite frequently. They haven't done this yet. When does this become a problem?
Well, I mean, I think one rule of thumb might be just having the family caregiver drive it with that person.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's always a good way to do that every so often, to kind of see how they're driving. I think too that when you notice things like unexplained dents or dings in the vehicle, those are also good signs. And I think just having gentle conversations about, how driving is going, and if one of us had to give up driving, kind of what would that look like? Those are things that we want to kind of take a look at in terms of how the person is doing and managing at the time.
So we can't just say, once someone reaches moderate stage, they shouldn't be driving anymore.
No, I mean, I think typically the moderate stage, that is often when people are giving up the driving, because as you know, that their visual spatial skills, their ability to have good judgment, their reaction time is clearly affected at that time. I think what's problematic for families, though, is that they're often waiting for the person to say, hey, here's my keys, and it doesn't always happen that way. The average person with dementia, only about 15% of those folks tend to have good insight or awareness into their own memory loss. It's not because they're being difficult or stubborn, but they really think things are going just as well as they were 5 or 10 years ago. So it's really the family that is burdened often with kind of taking on this approach of how do we make sure that we're maintaining that person's dignity and sense of self and autonomy, while we are really responsible for that person and our community's safety.
Mm-hmm. A fine line to walk, for sure. I know I hear quite frequently from people, well, what if they're just driving locally? They only go to the same grocery store they've been going to for 20 years, or here in the Valley, especially in the West Valley, what if they're just driving the golf cart? How do you respond to that?
I mean, I think that, again, I think it's good to work with the medical professional to really assess how this person's doing and whether cognitively it's appropriate for them to continue driving. On the other hand, I always think it's really positive when people who are aging adults or have some other issue that affects their driving self-limit. So they start saying things like, well, I'm not going to drive at night. I'm going to avoid highways. I don't drive in traffic during rush hour. I stay close to home. This question was posed at a recent workshop that I was part of about driving, and a colleague who actually runs a driving evaluation program said, her concern about golf carts is that obviously it uses the same skills that you need to drive a car. And if you're having a hard time with a car, what makes you think that a golf cart is going to be any better? And I think her other point was very well taken, in that she said, you're much more vulnerable in a golf cart. So if you had an accident and you were in a car, an SUV, you've got all of that metal as somewhat of a protection. But if you're in a golf cart and you have an accident, I mean, it's like there's no doors. I mean, there's really no protection. There's no seat belts. There's no there's nothing that's going to protect you, your physical self, from safety. Airbags was the word I was trying to think of. There aren't airbags that are going to pop up either. So she was indicating that she thought it was even more, a greater vulnerability for people to drive golf carts in that way.
Interesting. So I mean, we all can agree that driving does become dangerous at a certain point, and we do need to have the conversation, but this is such a delicate one to have. So do you have any strategies for how do you even know when to start the conversation?
Well, I think like any difficult conversation, you always kind of have to look for the best time of day, the person's mood to be somewhat in a good place. You don't want to be reactive. You don't want to scold the person. A lot of it is just using the golden rule. I mean, Heather, today if I told you I was taking your keys, how would you feel about that? How would you react? So being really sensitive and gentle. Don't assume that the person is going to kind of be along your same lines of thinking. Imagine and expect that they're going to be defensive with you. So I think what we really want to do is kind of avoid some of those common pitfalls that we talk about a lot here at Banner Alzheimer's Institute, you know, avoiding arguments, avoid coercing the person, scolding, or even threatening them. But instead trying to have a calm and open conversation, you know, about safety. You know, I want to make sure you're safe. I want to make sure people around you are safe. I want to, you know, I really care about you, and I just want to make sure that you're safe. And then also kind of having plans to get the person where they need to go. So we don't want to take away someone's keys and have them become incredibly isolated and not participate in important activities or appointments or pastimes, because then we're creating multiple losses rather than just one.
So really start the conversation early. Do you think this is going to happen in just one conversation, or do you recommend kind of approaching this a few different times? Or
yeah, I mean, I think what can be challenging too about memory loss is that you might have the conversation with the person and they're on board and they say, that's fine. And then the next day or in the afternoon, they've either changed their mind or maybe don't even have recollection of the conversation before. So I think having gentle conversations more than one time is helpful, but to be prepared that you'll have to take steps to change the situation. Don't wait for the person thinking that on the fourth or fifth conversation that's when they're going to agree. You have a couple of conversations and then you kind of do what you need to do in a gentle and respectful way to make sure that that person's safe.
Okay. And what are some strategies for a successful conversation?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, having open conversations, saying things like, if you weren't able to drive, how would we handle that? Or I've been thinking about, you know, that you're aging or we're both aging, and, you know, if you couldn't drive or if I couldn't drive, you know, what are some of the resources that might be available to us? And this is what I've come up with. I think what we do is really kind of play upon that person's value system. So I think, you know, if that person is very focused on finances, you kind of weigh the benefits of giving up another vehicle and insurance and gas and how some of that money could be used to provide rides for the person or pay for Uber or Lyft or other driving programs, or find out what volunteer agencies offer drives to older adults to get to appointments or social activities. Explore those opportunities as a way of kind of buffering the idea of taking away the keys. But I know we might be looking at you giving up driving, but we have all these other opportunities and resources available to us to help you get where you need to go.
Okay. And is there anyone who can help reinforce this message? I know caregivers often feel like they're the ones who are delivering it alone, but if we can get others to join in and echo that sentiment, that oftentimes can be helpful.
Yeah, I think you kind of pick the best person. So it might be that it's the daughter. It may be that the person with memory loss may better hear it from someone else. Maybe it's their brother, or maybe it's someone they respect. I think picking somebody that seems to have a good rapport with that person is really important. I think we talk about, not blaming the person, but instead really focusing on things like liability issues or insurance coverage or safety, or being a responsible citizen. All those things can kind of help leverage your point. Sometimes we can do things like blame other drivers, maybe who are aggressive, or, you know, in the Phoenix metropolitan area, we can blame the fact that there's a lot more intensity in traffic and visitors here that make conditions more difficult. In other places, we can really focus more on poor weather conditions, like in the Midwest or back east, or more road construction, or even kind of leveraging what the person is comfortable with. There was a friend of mine who is a social worker herself and was having a really hard time dealing with this with her dad, who had dementia early, moving into the moderate phases. And he was not able or willing to discuss driving related to memory loss, but he did have macular degeneration and would often tell people about his vision changing. And so the conversation wasn't about memory loss and driving at all. It was about, we both agree that your sight is becoming a challenge for you, and so this is a perfect opportunity for us to discuss driving. And, you know, I know this is going to be hard for you, but I found a friend of mine who's willing to take you wherever you want to go, and he or she can take you to some of your exercise classes, and I can take you to church, and, you know, John's agreed to take you grocery shopping and all those things.
Mm-hmm. Those are all great strategies. And then what about like driving evaluations? If you go through a driving evaluation, can that?
Yeah, I think when the going gets rough, then you kind of have to up your game. So I think having the conversation, getting the person to agree is always the best, or implementing those supports and just kind of moving forward. But if not, getting the medical professional involved is really important, because you as a family member don't want to be the bad guy. You want somebody else to be the bad guy.
Yes.
And we can blame the doctor, we can blame the nurse practitioner. So having conversations with that person ahead of time, or passing a note, if you will, to the nurse before the appointment saying, you know, I'm really concerned about my mom, my dad, my spouse is driving. Could you please address it? And maybe they could do some kind of screening. There are other things that the medical professional could do. They could refer the person to have a driving evaluation. Sometimes when that person actually has a paper in front of them that says you did an evaluation and you're not in a good condition to drive, maybe that is enough for them. Mm-hmm. I will tell you though, driving evaluation companies are often expert, but depending on which part of town or which part of the country you live in, you may or may not have close access to one. Mm-hmm. The other thing to keep in mind is that they're not free, and they're typically not reimbursable by insurance or other coverage, so be prepared to pay $400 or $500 or more for an evaluation. But for that person's safety and what you save in them giving up driving, it may be worth it. And then I think, you know, the other option is to ask if the medical provider really does deem that that person has a safety issue, is for them to really kind of lay the law, if you will, you know, with a person, and being very direct and saying that I really don't want you to drive. Mm-hmm. And then kind of as a last resort, I mean, the driver, the medical professional or someone who's driven with or witnessed that person driving could fill out a driver condition report. Here in Arizona, that's on the Motor Vehicle Division website. Anyone can access that form. It's pretty simple. It could be filled out and mailed in. It can be done anonymously. And I had a gentleman I was working with a number of years ago who actually received a letter from the motor vehicle department, and it turned out that somebody in his church had seen him driving and was very worried and had filled out a form or written a letter, and the DMV sent him this letter requiring him to take a driver test at the DMV. He failed, and that's how he ended up losing his license, which was really heartbreaking for him. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, this was a gentleman who his family had really wanted him to move into a senior community. His wife had died several years ago, and so he was pretty alone most of the time, and went out for some activities, but was pretty isolated and really spent a lot of his time lonely. So it was a great segue to have them say, hey, Dad, this is really a positive sign. I mean, no, it's terrible that you have to give up driving, but we've been talking about the center that you went to that you really liked and have a friend or two there. Mm-hmm. This is maybe the best time to make that transition into independent or assisted living, because we're giving up the car, and then you'll have meals, and you'll have activities, and they have a van that takes people to the science museum and to plays and to shows, and this might be a perfect time for us to make that transition happen.
So interesting, and reiterating really the importance of how you tone your message. I mean, obviously this is going to be a really difficult conversation to have with someone, but if you can find the positives and keep reiterating the positives in it, that can be really helpful.
Yeah, and I think recognizing, a couple things. One is, as we mentioned, the person often doesn't have insight, so they're not trying to be difficult. They maybe really don't know how they got that dent in their car, or they don't remember that near miss. Mm-hmm. They think they're driving just fine. And secondly, to remember that, dementia can often create a situation where the person who's living with it is losing control over their life, right? So we're now dictating when they have medical appointments and when they drive and when they have meals, and often have to help with hands-on care. So it can really create a situation where the person feels like they're losing control. So being very sensitive to that and being very empathic and gentle in your approach is going to go much farther than finger pointing and getting angry, which will create lots of tension between you and the person with dementia, and that's never a place we want to be. We always want to be aligned with them and on their side. Okay. So that's where blaming somebody else or having gentle conversations and just telling the person you're really concerned about them is really important. And I think one rule of thumb for caregivers is to say to yourself, would I let this person drive grandchildren or the neighborhood kids, right? So if you're putting kids in the car with that person, would you feel like they're going to be safe? And I think the answer to your question is often one more of honesty and saying, no, really, it is time to make driving, to have a driving retirement, as they say.
Which kind of leads into our next question. What can you do when reason doesn't seem to be working? Because sometimes you can point to the insurance liability, you can point to the dings in the car, and whether it's memory and they don't recall the incidents or they don't recall the conversations, or it's, as you mentioned earlier, the lack of insight into the disease process. Sometimes using rational explanations isn't going to work for someone. What
Absolutely.
Can you do then?
And if you have had these conversations and they end up in fights or arguments, then you know that talking isn't working. Mm-hmm. So that's when you have to approach the medical professional, or even just control access. So we had a family that we consulted with, and the father was in his early 90s and had early moving into moderate dementia, and he just absolutely refused to give up driving. And he ended up having hospitalization for another health-related issue. And while he was in the hospital, his kids decided, he really needed more care, he needed more support, and he really shouldn't be driving. So after the discharge from the hospital, they moved him into an assisted living center. And while he promised not to drive, he really wanted his prized truck to be at the assisted living center with him. So they kind of made the mistake of bringing the truck there. But what happened is that the truck and keys and those kinds of things are just triggers for somebody thinking about driving. So we had to find a way to make that car disappear. And sometimes that's where that therapeutic fibbing comes in. It's not something we want to do, and it's not something we want to have to present to the person, but we often use therapeutic fibbing not to hurt that person, but to soften things. So we had to concoct a story about that the truck was not functioning well and had to be at the auto dealership. And so then the dealers became the bad guy. Well, when is my truck going to be ready? Well, it's not quite ready yet, and you're right, I'm going to call the dealership and give that repairman a piece of my mind. And then we changed the subject. So I think removing the keys, in some cases, people have had to disable cars so that the person wouldn't drive, or put a club on the car so that the person wouldn't drive. I had a woman I worked with in counseling. She was taking care of her husband, who every day still got up and got ready for work, even though he had been retired for quite a while. And she would hand him a key that didn't work to the car. He would go out to the car and swear a bit when the key wasn't working. And then she would say to him, hey, I just talked to the office and they don't need you today, and I'm so excited we're going to spend the day together. Why don't you come inside? I made you some breakfast. We're going to have some coffee, and then we're going to make some plans for your day off. So I think being creative is really important, but sometimes you have to disable or even sell the vehicle. And again, we don't have conversations about those things. We just make them happen, and we apologize later.
And I think you bring up a great point about sometimes we trigger accidentally these things happening. I don't know where you keep your keys, but I keep my keys on a hook right inside the door. And if I had someone with dementia who I didn't want to drive, hanging those keys in a visible location is going to trigger them to remember driving and want to drive again.
And you're right, logic doesn't apply. So I worked with another family, and they had hired a caregiver to take care of their mom. She was very accepting of that, gratefully, but she did not want to give up driving. And so they put up a sign in the door to the garage that said, remember, you don't drive, and that didn't work at all. So we had to actually remove the car, and then the caregiver would say, when she'd say, where's the car? She'd go into the garage, she'd say, oh, don't you remember your daughter sent it off to be repaired? Or you gave it to your grandson because he was going to college and he really needed a car, and I know you're sorry about that now, but that was such a nice thing that you did, and I'm here now, so it doesn't make any difference. I'll take you anywhere you want to go. So, and those situations are really, really hard to repair. I mean, I had a situation with another daughter whose mom refused to give up driving, and to the point where she had to come and remove the car, and she remembered that her daughter did that and was very angry with her for a long period of time. So we had to play good cop, bad cop. The other daughter was the one who didn't take away the car, so at least she was able to spend time with her until she cooled off, which took quite a while. But the most important thing is that they weren't worried every time their mom went out driving about whether she was going to get home safely or kill someone in the process.
Well, and with that, our time has come to a close this morning. Thank you so much, Lori, for spending some time with us and sharing your expertise on this difficult topic often for caregivers to deal with.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think just using a gentle, compassionate approach is always the right way to go about it. And if you don't get what you need in that route, ask for help. Ask for help with siblings or other family members or the medical provider to really help you accomplish this goal.
Great. Thank you. And thank you to all of our attendees today. As I mentioned at the start of this session today, in reflecting on this 2018 and looking ahead to 2019, we have looked at our history of webinars that we have been providing. Over the past 3 years, we've provided 36 webinars for caregivers. And assessing moving forward in 2019, we've decided with the breadth of online education that's available, we will be spending our efforts more locally and putting on different conferences and those sorts of things. So I want to thank all of you who've been joining us over this entire time frame and remind you that our sessions are archived on our website. So please go back and access those 36 incredible topics that we've put together for you. Today's session has been recorded and it will be housed on our website as well. Thank you so much for attending Dementia Dialogues, where we bring the dementia education to you. All the best in the new year.